Okay. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Joining us and watching the recording. We're going to wait a little bit for people to trickle in, and then we're going to start. Okay. I think we have a good amount here, so we can start. So, hi, everyone. Welcome. Today is the latest in SEN Talks speaker series. It's called SEN Explained. So our intention is to form partnerships with professionals, lay people, everyone in between to discuss special educational needs and neurodiversity broadly. We attempt to move the conversation forward in these spaces to foster understanding and empathy and more inclusive practices on the whole. My name is Valenza, and if you're not familiar with our work at SENTalk, we're a nonprofit organization based in London with a mission to improve social and emotional outcomes and promote inclusion for children and young people with SEN and their families. So today we're delighted to have Cathy Wassell with us to discuss internal presentations of autism in young people, the link to mental health and masking, and how to provide support as a parent carer. So following our discussion, there'll be an open kind of question and answer session. So if you'd like, please ask questions, make comments at any time during the webinar by typing in the chat box. It should be to the right of your screen. This session will be recorded and circulated on YouTube. For if you'd like to circulate it, watch it later on. I'd now like to introduce Cathy. So Cathy is a neurodivergent parent of 2 neurodivergent young people. She's the CEO of Autistic Girls Network and soon-to-be published author of Nurturing Your Autistic Young Person, coming from Jessica Kingsley Publishers in December of this year. Autistic Girls Network is a new charity supporting autistic girls and their families, campaigning for earlier diagnosis and educating about how to foster earlier recognition and nurture a positive autistic identity. So thank you so much for being with us, Cathy.
You're welcome.
And I'll turn the session over to you.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, if we can get started with the slides, that would be great. Okay, so we are talking today about how do you recognize a presentation that's perhaps not quite the classic presentation that many people might recognize. And obviously I run Autistic Girls Network, and this is a presentation that is relatively common in girls, but definitely not exclusively girls. So it may be quite common in those who are brought up as girls. It may be quite common in non-binary young people and common in some boys too. In fact, certainly this is the presentation that my nephew has. So just a little bit about me. I mean, I think Valenza said most things. So we're all neurodivergent in our family. We have lots of flavors of neurodivergence in there. We like to collect them all. I'm also studying a master's at the moment, and I have, unfortunately, far too much experience with intensive support team, CAMS, social care, getting an EHCP, flex learning, absence from school, and specialist schools. Happy experience with specialist schools, actually, but the rest of it, not perhaps quite so happy. And just to start off, I'm just going to talk a tiny little bit about language so that you can understand where I'm coming from. So we obviously use the term autistic in our title, and in our Facebook group, we have a closed Facebook group with almost 11,000 people in it. We don't use the term ASD. And obviously I realize that that is the term that you hear as parents when your child is diagnosed or when you are diagnosed. But as it includes the word disorder, this is rejected by many people in the autistic community, quite rightly, because it's not an illness, it's not a disorder, it's just a different way of thinking. And so that's why we don't use the term ASD. We don't use person first language. So that means saying person with autism rather than autistic person. And that's because identity first language, autistic person, has been shown by various research papers and surveys to be favoured by a lot of people in the autistic community. Also, it doesn't actually make sense to say person with autism. Autism is not a handbag that you can pick up and put down. It can't be extracted from a person. If it was, that person would be a different person. So that's why we prefer identity first language. We also don't like the use of functioning labels, low functioning, high functioning, mild, severe, because all people who are autistic are autistic. They all have support needs. Some of those needs might be different to others, but they also change according to the environment and according to what's happening around them, according to whether they're ill or whether they're very, very anxious at the time. Their support needs will change. And so functioning labels aren't necessarily helpful. And then our white paper, which was published on International Women's Day this year, this really sets out what we feel is important about how internal presentation should be recognised and supported. And it particularly emphasises the fact that it's really important for autistic children to be picked up before they transfer to secondary school, because that transition to secondary school is very, very traumatic for them if they are not being recognised and supported. And unfortunately, we did a survey in the Facebook group. It's probably 3 years ago now, so we really need to do it again. And we asked parents, what was the point where your child really couldn't manage anymore and it all went downhill? And we found that the average was February half term of year 7. So the children had gone through the transition, they'd made it up to Christmas, they'd come back after Christmas and it wasn't getting any better. Probably it was getting worse and they just couldn't manage. And after February half term of year 7, many of them really started being absent from school a lot, started being very anxious, started having big drops in their mental health. So that is something that you can read for free on our website. So let's just have a look about the facts surrounding autism in girls. And in particular, I am talking about autism in girls here because that's what the statistics are about. Unfortunately, there are very few statistics that look at autism in non-binary young people, and there's almost no statistics that look at an internal presentation of autism in boys. So, you know, I'm working with the statistics that we are able to get. And what we find is that if we're looking at children and young people with autism plus learning disability, the statistics are quite different. They're 1 in 2. If we look at all autism, including those who don't have a learning disability, which is most autistic people, there are in fact more autistic people who are epileptic than there are autistic people who have a learning disability. The rate is different. Some people say it's 1 in 3, some people say it's 1 in 4. However, it definitely looks different. Is it actually different? Probably not, no. Some of the difficulties that autistic girls struggle with are in fact caused by our society and the way that we treat girls differently. So they have different social norms. And if you read the white paper, you can see that we're talking about things like expectations of girls around being messy, expectations of girls around playing outside and being boisterous, and all those things, where we have different expectations of girls and boys. And autistic girls tend to camouflage how they behave. They pick up on the fact that there is a stigma surrounding autism and they mask their behaviour to try and fit in. But this is not good for their mental health. Masking is causes really, really poor mental health. Autistic girls can definitely be part of friendship groups. They tend not to be the leader in those groups, so they tend to be more on the fringe. And they also have more of what is called repetitive behaviours. I don't like that term. All of us, all humans, have repetitive behaviours. That might be stimming. It might be talking about watching the same kind of TV program. It might be watching football matches endlessly. But only autistic, or what is seen as classically autistic repetitive behaviours, gets the bad rap and the stigma that surrounds it when we use that phrase. And girls may tend to have these behaviours, but they're more internalized. So their thoughts, they are routines, they're rituals. And that's how we will see in another slide, autistic girls can tend to also develop OCD in an internal way as well. So some children don't present in the classical way. We all have a stereotype of autism, don't we? And generally it's a white boy, maybe lining up trains or cars, or being really interested in trains. And, that's the classic presentation. But, obviously it's much, much wider than that. So girls may be masking their autistic traits. Some boys too, some non-binary young people. But unfortunately, the way that we diagnose autism tends to be by behaviour that you might only see in a crisis or when the child is really distressed. And this is a big issue with diagnostic criteria of autism. My daughter was in hospital this weekend, last weekend, with COVID related. And behaviours that I saw from her, such as flapping and hitting her head, I had never seen before. She's 17. I had never seen her do those. For her, those behaviours that might be seen as classically autistic, they were very, very distressed behaviours. And that is the kind of thing that will happen when a young person is distressed. Autistic girls and autistic people who present in this way may appear to be much more social than you might expect, than their classically autistic peers, for example, and may appear to have lots of friends and want to socialise quite a lot. So with their friends are a comfort. They are a comforting factor when you move up to secondary school as well. So we found in some research that we did on transition to secondary school that moving up with lots of friends delayed the point where things broke down. So that February half term in year 7 might have been extended into the summer term or extended into year 8, as in fact it was for my daughter, because she moved up with a lot of friends. They may not also get pop culture, but they might. They tend to have special interests which are in line with other girls. It's just that they are more intense, and that's perhaps why they don't get picked up so much. They may play in a different way to their neurotypical peers, but it's a perfectly valid way of playing. And what you're going to pick up from this talk, and hopefully what you've picked up anyway, is that things are just different. There is not a right way of doing things and a right way of thinking about things. There are different ways, and they're all valid. And autistic communication itself is valid. There has been multiple research studies now which have shown that autistic people communicate very well with each other. And in fact, when you're looking at communication between autistic people and neurotypical people, it's actually the neurotypical people who are not able to communicate very well with the autistic people. So we need to open our minds to different ways of communication and stop trying to force autistic young people to communicate in a certain way, which isn't natural for them. this is why it's important that we need a whole school approach, well, a whole society approach actually, but if we're talking about education, we need a whole school approach towards neurodiversity. Neurodiversity meaning the diversity of all human brains, such as biodiversity being the diversity of all plants and growing things. The more their non-autistic peers learn about neurodiversity and how brains can work differently and how people can experience things differently, the better and the more accepting that they'll be. Your autistic young person, if they present internally, is probably quite shy in class, probably don't raise their hand or speak out much, probably don't get in trouble, although they might, especially if they also have ADHD, which many autistic people do. Research is now showing up to 80% of autistic people also have another neurodivergent condition, which may be ADHD or maybe dyslexia or dyspraxia. They are very likely to mask at school, so to mask their autistic traits at school, and then because masking is very, very exhausting and sometimes painful, they explode when they get home or when they get in the car. And although you may be told that they are fine at school, this explosion and this distress once they come out of school shows you that they are not fine at school. They may also be situationally mute, and you may have heard of a different term for this kind of mutism, but I prefer situationally mute because it shows that there is no choice in this for them. It's not an actual choice to stop speaking. It's caused by anxiety and not feeling safe. So if you take your young person to the doctor, for example, and they are unable to speak or they just whisper, this is probably what's happening. They're not feeling safe, and they need you to speak for them. Autistic young people who present internally are much, much more likely to have some kind of anxiety-led school absence. And again, this is not a choice for them. So I don't use the term school refusal. They are not refusing to go to school. They are unable to go to school. And unfortunately, it is much more likely in this cohort because the lack of recognition and the masking has caused poor mental health, and school is a traumatic place for them for many reasons, most of which may well be sensory, but also because they don't feel understood at school. They may be disinterested in sport. Sport can be, especially team sport, can be difficult for many reasons, not least of which social reasons and needing to get up close and do things with people that they perhaps might not know very well. Also, a lot of autistic people are also dyspraxic, and so ball sports can be quite scary because if you suddenly have balls thrown at you all the time, especially if you're playing something like dodgeball, where the aim is to throw a ball at somebody, if you aren't confident of being able to catch that ball or do whatever you're supposed to do with it, then that game is not a fun game. So that may happen. Not always, of course. There are autistic athletes, and obviously they very much like sport, but it's something that comes up a lot in this cohort. They also, as we've talked about a bit, the traditional interests may not be present. Still, there is likely to be an element of what's called monotropism. So that's an interest in a single subject or being very, very interested in, particular things. That's still likely to be there. But they might be things like Harry Potter or K-pop or the kind of interest that you would expect young girls to be interested in. It's just that they are likely to be very, very interested in them. So it's really important that we don't make snap judgments based on what we think is autism, because there's a lot more going on here. These young people may also be very perfectionist. It's something that we see quite a lot in the cohort. It can depend, of course, on their confidence and how much they've had that self-confidence knocked before. But it tends to be a trait that we see quite a lot, that perfectionism, not being satisfied with something until it's absolutely as they want it, and perhaps destroying something if it's not as perfect as they want it to be, which obviously in itself is frustrating for them because they've put work into it. They also can be very, very clever at compensating so that they are disguising what's going on from their teachers. And as we've talked about before, the situational mutism can make it very difficult to use strategies which can sometimes be put in place, such as timeout cards to get out of class. If you really don't want to draw attention to yourself, then you may not be able to put up your hand and show a card which is singling you out in front of the class. So that can also be quite difficult. You may find, the median age for diagnosing a girl autistic in the UK is 13. So obviously that is secondary school age. So you may find that your child manages okay in primary school, doesn't have too many problems. Probably when you look back, you will find things that you think, oh, that's why that happened. And certainly we did. My daughter was diagnosed at 13. But it's likely that there hasn't been a load of alarm bells ringing. But the transition to secondary is what causes the massive decrease in good mental health. It will be much better if you can harness their special interests. And again, I don't really like the term special interests. I'm only really using it because it's become quite a well-known term. But the reason I don't like it is because we all have special interests, don't we? If your husband, brother is absolutely into Manchester United, for example, huge fan, watches everything, reads everything, looks at everything online, reads biographies of Manchester United players, that's a pretty special interest, I would say. But it's not treated in the same way as autistic special interests are. And that's all wrong. And we need to destigmatize the idea of autistic special interests. However, an autistic person tends to be quite monotropic. They tend to have what's called an attention tunnel, and you're going to do much better if you're not always trying to pull them out of that attention tunnel. So harness those special interests. These young people are also likely to find unstructured time at school difficult. So although they may find aspects of the classroom difficult, of course, they may have cognitive difficulties, they may have sensory difficulties in class because they can't filter noise or they can't filter smell, etc. But it's likely that breaks and lunchtime and clubs are going to be the most difficult part of their day because they're dealing with other people who are unpredictable. They don't know what's going to happen. And those times are scary. So putting in some kind of structure in those times is likely to be good for your young person. Obviously, everyone is different. All autistic people are different to each other, and you're going to need to find what works for that young person in particular. But if we have to generalize, then I would say unstructured times are the most difficult part of the school day. Things like the dinner hall and everyone eating in a dinner hall, especially in a huge secondary school, that's also going to be very difficult for sensory reasons. All that noise, all those people in close proximity, the smells, that's going to be hard. Assemblies are also hard. You're all sitting together really close. You don't know what's going to happen. And that unpredictability causes uncertainty always. If they are in a class where the teacher tends to shout a lot, that is going to be distressing for an autistic young person. Anything which causes conflict or feels like they are being told off, even if it's not them that's being told off, it's likely to be distressing for them. They also it may be difficult for them to differentiate between the whole class being told off and they themselves being told off. So it really needs to be made plain that they aren't doing anything wrong. Lessons like PE can be difficult, not only because we've talked about perhaps not liking sport, but those lessons are chaotic and unpredictable and you don't know what's going to happen. So it's things like PE, design and technology, where people are moving around the classroom, maybe some science practical lessons, food tech, those kind of lessons where things happen that you can't predict and people are moving around, can be difficult. And if a lesson like PE causes a lot of distress, it can be a reasonable adjustment to not have to do it. And obviously, that is very much an individual case-by-case basis. If you read the white paper that I've talked about, there is something in there regarding needing specific and adapted sex education. And autistic young people, especially young autistic women, can be quite vulnerable. And also, you need the specificity. You need very, very specific sex education around things like periods, etc., because we use a lot of euphemisms in daily life, especially around things like that, because we don't like talking about them. And those euphemisms are not going to be picked up easily by an autistic young person. We also say things that when you actually analyse the language, we don't really mean. And young autistic people tend to think in very black and white terms, very literal terms. So you need to really think about what you're saying and be very specific about it, and chuck out all of those euphemisms. Also, for autistic girls and young women, things like periods have a huge sensory aspect to them as well. Each month, the extra pain, the bleeding, the needing to clean more, the needing to perhaps either use pads or tampons or anything like that, is causing extra sensory distress. And that's why we often recommend period pants instead of anything else. But even that has a difficult sensory aspect. And so it is something that needs much more thought. And of course, these days we have to educate girls about that earlier than we used to. So, you might well start your periods age 9 or something like that. So it is something that needs particular attention. And in school, unfortunately, research shows that autistic people are much more likely to be bullied and to generally have a school life that's very difficult. And educating other students, educating all students, whole school, about that and about neurodiversity is again going to make autistic pupils' lives easier. Now, anxiety is a difficult subject to talk about, because if you are a parent of a young person who has had to go through CAMS at any time, then you have probably been told that being anxious is just part of autism and there's nothing you can do about it. Oh, if you're autistic, you're anxious. And this is not true. There may be a higher level of anxiety and there may be more propensity to be anxious, but it is not the case that every autistic person is super, super anxious all the time. It's to do with environment. It's to do with what's happening around them. It's to do with autonomy. And there are ways, for sure, there are ways that you can make people be in an environment which will help them to lower their anxiety. There's also ways that you can help them to regulate their emotions better and to regulate their anxiety levels better. We are definitely saying that stress is going to be caused by things being different and by new things and by change. That is definitely part of an autistic profile. But there are ways to introduce change that can make it less stressful. Statistically, mental ill health is more likely, and the older they are, the more likely that they're has been incidences of mental ill health. However, again, this is not because of autism. It's not because they're autistic. It's because the environment they are in is not a friendly environment towards autistic people. So there are things that we can do to make the environment better for them and to surround them with people that understand neurodiversity better. There does seem to be a tendency for internalizing and intrusive thoughts. Again, this is going to be lessened by changing the environment and surrounding them with people who understand. And it's not inevitable to have poor mental health if everyone understands, and that includes school as well. Research has definitely shown that there is a higher likelihood that an autistic person will have an eating disorder. Some of this will be around restricted eating, and a lot of it tends to be around a need for autonomy rather than a worry about what your body looks like, for example. This is something, I mean, you could do a whole talk on eating disorders alone, and there is one, in fact, on the Autistic Girls Network YouTube channel. So, I can't talk about it for very long now, but restricted eating is not necessarily an eating disorder. So there is eating disorder called ARFID, which stands for Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. And that tends to be relatively common for autistic people. And that is around restriction of food choice. But it's not, just restricted eating and liking to eat the same things often is not the same. And it's not an eating disorder. One thing that I would say here is where I've put screen for other neurodivergent conditions. As I mentioned, autism rarely happens on its own. It's very likely that if you're autistic, you're some other form of neurodivergence as well. And likely also if you're ADHD, that you have some other form of neurodivergence as well. So it's always worth keeping an open mind about those things, because it's likely that they'll probably turn up, issues around it will probably turn up at some point, and it's useful to know what might be happening, what might be going on. I just wanted briefly to talk about emotions. Emotions can be difficult for autistic people to talk about, and that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, although I haven't put it first, is something called interoception, which is one of our senses. And interoception is being able to feel things in your body. So, for example, when we feel cold, it's actually caused by nerve endings in our skin, which are telling us that the temperature's changed and that we're cold, and we've got goosebumps or something. That's a physical manifestation of that sense of feeling cold. When we feel hungry, we have a rumbly tummy or something, and we can feel something in our tummy. But if you have poor interoception, you can't necessarily identify those signals that your nerve endings are sending to your brain. And so some autistic people, not all, but some autistic people find it difficult to tell when they're hungry or thirsty, or when they're hot or cold. Sorry. Sudden frog in my throat there. And so that's how interoception, not understanding on your body, not being able to interpret those signals, can make things difficult for you. Because if you can feel something in your stomach, but you can't identify what it is, you don't know whether it's feeling hungry, you don't know whether it's having butterflies in your stomach and feeling excited, or you don't know whether it's actual stomach pain. Those things can be quite difficult. And then if we also look at the first thing that is on the list there, alexithymia. That alexithymia is being unable to identify or express emotions. And those two things working together can make it quite difficult to understand how you feel and talk about how you feel. Because again, if you, going back to that feeling in the stomach, if you can't actually identify whether you're excited or you're hungry or you're scared or you've got a tummy ache, that makes life quite difficult. And it's actually quite frustrating, and it's quite scary in a way, because you don't really know what's going on, and you can't tell it's something serious or something that's easily changed, like just, needing to eat something. So those things are quite difficult. But there's also a lot of myths surrounding autism, probably the biggest of which is that autistic people have no empathy. This is absolute rubbish, to be quite frank with you. There are many autistic people, and I know many of them, who are intensely empathetic, intensely to the point of pain in some cases, and feel hugely the emotions of other people. And so put it out of your mind that autistic people don't feel empathy. It's not true. What is different is that they may feel just as much empathy for animals or objects like teddy bears, for example, as they do for humans. And that's why they may seem to be really, really upset when something happens to a pet or an animal on TV, or, a favourite object at home. And they may one difference between a classical presentation and an internal presentation of autism is that they may be more likely to have autistic shutdown rather than autistic meltdown. That's not always the case, of course, but there will be plenty of autistic women who've hardly ever had what you would notice as an autistic meltdown. They might notice it, and they might not be able to recognise it now once they get to know themselves better. But it wouldn't probably be obvious to somebody in the street, for example. And then a quick whiz through sensory stuff. So there may be very strong sensitivity in all the different senses. So noise, smell, taste, touch. And this can involve not being able to filter noises. So noises seeming much louder, such as people chewing, for example, at the dinner table, but also being unable to filter out noises. So if you're in a classroom and you can hear the birds singing outside, you can hear things going on in the next door classroom, you can hear somebody behind you tapping their pen, you can hear the buzz of the electric light switch. All of those things make it almost impossible, if you can't filter, make it almost impossible to be able to concentrate on what the teacher is saying at the time. And the same with smell and taste and touch. There are all difficult sensory sensitivities which make everyday life more difficult, really, and more complicated. School uniform can be a really difficult one, because if your skin is super sensitive, you may well not be able to wear tights, for example, because they've got seams in the toes, and you may not be able to wear ties because you can't bear the touch of something going all the way around your neck. And there's lots of different reasons, and it's going to be different for everybody, because all autistic people are different. But the most important thing is to believe people when they say that, such and such is so itchy they can't bear it, or such and such they can't bear their clothes are hurting, the seams are hurting, the hem of their jeans are hurting, and all those things. Believe them, because they are actually hurting. And unfortunately, it can get quite expensive. So I can tell you from personal experience, it can get quite expensive. And it's likely to mean that if sensory needs are very strong, it's likely to mean that there's probably not many clothes that they will be able to wear. But you can get through it. You can get through it, and you can find the ones that do work and make sure you have a few of those. And it's not the end of the world if your child or you wear the same thing every day, as long as you've got a few copies of it, if you like. It's not the end of the world. Who cares? Who cares if you're wearing winter clothes in summer and all those things? Hygiene related things can be difficult. So baths and showers can be difficult. And again, this is a sensory thing. It's to do with the feel of the water on you at the time. It's to do with how your skin feels different when you step out from the shower, for example, and suddenly it's cold and you've got this cold air and wet skin and all of those things. All of those things can be very difficult. And again, it's going to be on a very individual basis, but there are ways around it. And the best thing to do is to ask other autistic people, autistic adults, how they deal with it. So if you join a Facebook group like Autistic Girls Network, we have a closed Facebook group, you will see lots of questions about this kind of thing. You know, how can I help my daughter, you know, wash her hair? She won't have a hair wash, and all things like that. Ask autistic adults how they got through it. And also how to develop self-soothing for when you are overloaded. Again, that is going to be a very individual thing, because it's going to depend which senses are overloaded. It's going to depend on what their triggers are, and it's going to depend on what works for them. How do they make things better for them? So, for example, for my daughter, she needs to pace in the garden. She needs to listen to her music through headphones, and those things will help to soothe her. They won't help if she's in crisis, and if you've already reached meltdown, they won't help then. But if you can get to a point where the young person can recognize that they need self-soothing and they know what to do, then things are going to be better, and you're going to be avoiding more meltdowns. Now, that's not something that's going to happen straight away, and you might need perhaps an occupational therapist to help you with that and to help them with that, but it definitely can happen. So there is definitely a postcode lottery in diagnosis of girls in this country. As it says there, in some areas of England, a study last year was it last year? It might have been the year before now, showed that 13 times as many boys were diagnosed. In other areas, 2 times as many. And that is a postcode lottery, unfortunately. But you will find that there are people that don't know much about autism, but may think that they know a lot. And unfortunately, that's the worst case. That's the worst case scenario, because that kind of level of knowledge is dangerous, because you're spreading myths. Myths like being autistic is a label and you don't want to be labeled. Well, I'm sorry, but if you're neurodivergent of any flavour and you get to be an adult, you've already been given plenty of labels in your life, and there'll be labels that aren't nice. Things like you're lazy or you're stupid, or, you know, all of those kind of things. And there's nothing wrong with being autistic. So be happy to have that label, if that's what you want to call it. But being called autistic is not the same as being called lazy or stupid. It's not a bad thing. It's you, and it's part of your identity. And if you've been autistic since the moment that you were born, you would be a different person without that. And it can't be removed anyway. So it's not helpful to go around saying that being autistic is a label that somebody doesn't want. It is true that it may make life more difficult to be openly autistic, and that's up to the person, especially when they are an adult. It's up to them if they want to disclose if they are autistic. And there are very, very many autistic professionals, teachers, psychiatrists, GPs, etc., who don't say that they are autistic because of that stigma. But that's not a situation we want to carry on. We want everyone to be able to be openly autistic, because that is what's going to improve mental health. And that's what is going to improve life for everybody, really, because it's going to improve life for autistic people who will see that there's representation of them in the world, in literature, at school, at the doctors, and it's going to improve everyone else's understanding of neurodiversity. So that's really something that we'd like to see happen. Being diagnosed, however, should bring support, but those adjustments, those reasonable adjustments, should happen anyway without diagnosis. If there is a need identified, a special need identified, then you should be getting support anyway, although I know that doesn't always happen. So I think I'm going to skip this slide because I think I have explained autistic masking, but if anyone has any questions about it, then please feel free to ask me. And, you know, perhaps it is helpful to go through this one, which looking at why people mask. Again, this is a survival instinct. It's to make you feel more normal, to help you fit in, and to avoid the stigma of being autistic and the knowledge that autistic people are bullied. And often your brain can do this without you actually realizing that you're doing it. So, you know, children like my daughter had absolutely no idea that she was autistic any more than we did. And it was a huge surprise to everybody. But she had been masking for all that time, because that's what her brain told her to do. Her brain told her that was the safe thing to do. So how do you spot it? Well, it's going to be those children who don't put their hands up or speak in class, who explode when they get home, who tend to be mute in certain situations, who have a really strong fight, flight, freeze, fawn reflex. They may well be emo or goth at some point in probably early teens. They may have difficulty with group work at school, because they have to be put with people that they don't really know very well and they have to work with them. They may have quite intense friendships, and they may find conflict quite difficult. Something else that may happen a lot is there's a difference in pain experience, if you like. So some people are hypersensitive to pain. They feel it more strongly. And some autistic people are hyposensitive to pain. They don't really feel it. But this means that when you go to the doctors or when you go to A&E with a certain situation, there may be assumptions made that aren't based on an autistic person's reality, because that person may not be making a face that shows that they are in pain, but they are. I did a tweet on my personal Twitter account just talking about that, and I had a huge number of responses, and there were people in the comments who had had a broken leg for 2 weeks and things like that, or they'd almost died because their appendix needed to come out, but they weren't showing it on their face. And so the doctors didn't pick it up until it was almost too late. And there's lots of situations like that. So we do need to be aware, all of us, but particularly health professionals, of course, but all of us need to be aware that autistic people may experience pain differently. And because of poor interoceptive skills, they may understand pain differently. And we also need to be careful about how we ask about pain as well, because if you ask, do you get lots of headaches, but you don't specify, you're not specifying, then an autistic person may think that means, have you got a headache now? Have you got a lot of, have you got a big headache now? But of course, that's not actually what you're asking. So you need to be very specific about what you're asking as well, very literal about what you're asking. And the rest of that slide I have dealt with already. So Dr. Luke Bearden is who runs the autism course at Sheffield Hallam University. He's brilliant. We've done a webinar with him on our YouTube channel. And this is what he calls his golden equation. Autism plus environment equals outcome. And that is very much the case, whether it's at home, whether it's at school, whether it's in the workplace. If the environment is working for them, there will be a good outcome. If the environment is not working for them, there won't be a good outcome. And that's something that we all need to remember. And the things that can be difficult at school are these things. And we've touched on a lot of them. Buzzing lights, flickering lights, so many people in the corridor when you have to change classrooms between lessons, the smell in the dining hall or the science lab, the noise of classrooms, the chaos of lessons where people are moving around, the school bell every hour. And even though it's going every hour, it can be really, really alarming every hour. School uniform, the sensory aspects, hearing, being able to hear lots and lots of people eating in the same room. Imagine that you had, if you're not autistic yourself, imagine that you've got really, really sensitive hearing and you can hear people eating, chewing really loudly across the room, and then multiply that by 300, 500 people in the same room, all chewing at the same time. It's not a nice scenario, is it? We also need to remember that making eye contact does not equal listening. So if you ask an autistic person, and again, depends on individuals, but if you ask an autistic person to make eye contact, it means that they can't concentrate on what you're saying, because they have to put so much focus into making eye contact, which can be painful, that they're not going to be listening. So it's entirely unproductive to ask an autistic person to make eye contact. And that's the same at home or at school. It does not equal listening. And the same with quiet hands and fidgeting. Autistic person and ADHD person may need to fidget to be able to focus. So if you're stopping them fidgeting, you're stopping them focusing on what you're saying. So again, it's not productive. People who present internally may be very unwilling to draw attention to themselves and to seem different and to speak out in class, and especially to be made to speak out in class. It's one thing volunteering, and they may volunteer, but it's quite another to be called upon to speak. And then I want to just go to the last one because it's important, and then I'll wind this up. If you make a promise, you need to keep that promise. It's really, really important, because you've said what's going to happen, and if that thing then doesn't happen, then that's change, and that's uncertainty, and that's anxiety, and you've broken the promise, and you've broken the trust. So it's really, really important to keep promises that you make, or don't make promises that you have no intention of keeping. Right, I'm going to skip these, but yeah, let's just go through this one quickly. It's quite likely that an autistic person who presents internally is not going to like making decisions, because there are a chain of consequences that happen if you make a decision. And it's a lot of responsibility for that to happen, but also it's really difficult, because how can you say which decision will be the right one? So tend to avoid making decisions, but also, and this is what I love about autistic people, have a really, really strong sense of social justice. If Superman really existed, I bet you he would be autistic. It's really, you're much more likely to see people like Greta Thunberg, for example, who of course is autistic, and you're much more likely to find people among crowds where there is something going on, where you're sticking up for the planet, or you're sticking up for animals, or you're sticking up for the underdog. It's definitely a thing. Also, unlikely to like Christmas and birthdays, because that is a big, big change, a big transition. Everything's happening differently. It's not how you want your everyday life to be, and so it can be quite difficult. And also there's this huge demand and expectation that you will like it, and you'll like the present that you're given. So that's also an issue that people need to be aware of, and we've got a blog on that on our website. Right, so this is my last thing that I would like to say to you. If you are neurotypical, open your mind to the idea that there's not one right way of doing almost anything, really, but especially ways that society says is the right way, such as, putting your fork together after you've finished your meal, your knife and fork rather, together after you've finished your meal, and all those things like that, especially manners, that society says, oh, this is the way that it has to be. It doesn't have to be that way. There are lots of right ways. And why is the majority way the right way? There is a theory called the double empathy theory, by an autistic scholar called Damien Milton. And he says that autistic people are often accused of a lack of empathy, which we've covered. But in fact, neurotypical people are seldom empathetic towards autistic people. They seldom put themselves in their shoes and alter their behaviour to accommodate autistic people. And so who really has the lack of empathy here? communication is a two-way street, and there needs to be work on both sides. If we're talking about things in, having sides, for us all to be able to accept each other and get along better. Right, I'm going to stop there. And I think my next slide probably has, a link to the white paper on if people need to see it.
Okay, Cathy, thank you for that helpful and insightful presentation.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think I probably went on too long there.
No, that's okay. That happens. So I'm just going to turn it over to Q&A. So if anyone even watching the recording, if you have comments, questions, you can send them in. So we have one here. It's here. So I'll just read it out to you, Cathy. So it says, despite all my 3 boys being diagnosed with autism at age 3, 3, and 2, and myself being diagnosed with ADHD at age 41, I have, after years of pushing, got an initial pediatric appointment for my 8-year-old daughter. Is there anything I should specify in case the doctor hasn't got experience with assessing girls?
Well, you could take our white paper along for a start, but if your daughter has 3 autistic siblings, it shouldn't be difficult to get a diagnosis of autism. I'm not saying that it won't be difficult, unfortunately, but it should be a walk in the park to get a diagnosis. However, I know that doesn't always happen. So I would. It's difficult, isn't it, when you're going with NHS if it's in the UK, or when you don't have control over who is going to be doing the assessment. Then I know that it can be difficult because you can't try and find somebody that's good at diagnosing girls. But yeah, I would just make sure that you go in very well armed, because they certainly will be speaking to you as well. You go in very well armed with traits that you can see that she's got, and you're checking them against. There's a long checklist in the white paper of traits, and be forearmed, and take that into the assessment with you, and just bring them up and say, I've read that these traits are very common in autistic girls as opposed to autistic boys, and cross your fingers and hope for the best is all I can say, really. But if it did happen that she didn't get a diagnosis and it was refused, you can ask for a second opinion, always.
Okay, cool. And since we don't have any more questions, I think I'll close out with one question, Cathy. So we did allude to kind of the conversation around reasonable adjustments with school being on board. For parents with children who are autistic that do have quite a few internal presentations, as you've detailed, what's the best way to go about these conversations, where schools sometimes they say, well, they're doing fine. How do we ask for that kind of support? What's the best way to get there?
Okay, well, if they are on what's called the pathway, if they are on the pathway to a diagnosis and they're on a waiting list, there shouldn't be, and I use the word shouldn't be, any problem in getting reasonable adjustments made. That's in the SEN code of practice, that if special needs are suspected, that there should be reasonable adjustments made. So that's something that you need to be taking up with the school if that's not happening. And you definitely need to use the language reasonable adjustments. I would have a read through the SEN code of practice. And you might also want to bring up the Equality Act 2010, because just having the term reasonable adjustment in there and Equality Act means that the school will recognise that there's a legal aspect to what's happening, and they can be open to disability discrimination.
Right.
I've lost the word, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, there's a lot of this, and a lot of being a parent of any child with SEND actually, is that you do have to arm yourself with knowledge. And things will go better for your child if you are armed with knowledge. And that's very unfortunate, because not all parents are able to do that. Not all parents have time or capacity or, you know, Wi-Fi to be able to do that. And I know that that's really hard, and it shouldn't happen. But unfortunately, that is the reality that we are in. And the more you know about it, and the more that you can show that you know about it, the better it will go for you. And again, send school the white paper. That happens quite a lot. We have diagnostic teams who have contacted us around the country actually, and they now give it out to people who have just been diagnosed, to families who have just been diagnosed. So it's totally legitimate to be able to do that, and you can send them a link, and it's free for them to read.
Okay, thank you for that. So I think that's it for our questions. What I'll do is I'll include Cathy's email if attendees have questions for follow-up. I know sometimes questions come after we've heard all this information, so it takes time to process. So I'll include that. And for those that have registered, I'll also include slides. Yeah, I think that's about it. So thank you so much, Cathy, for your time.
Oh, you're welcome.
Wonderful to have you on. Hopefully we'll have you on again.
Thank you.
And if, for those watching, if you'd like for us to continue the conversation, I'm sure Cathy would be willing to do future sessions, hopefully.
Absolutely.
And we can talk about maybe what else would be helpful for families. So I'll close it there. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.